Just about everything online gains some form of notoriety, and of course Fire Emblem games are no exception. The fandom will give you a number of shared sentiments, like Echoes has terrible maps, Tellius enemy phases take 10 years, Sacred Stones is easy, Genealogy is a walking sim, Engage is cringe, and in the case of today's subject, Fire Emblem the Binding Blade is bullshit. Okay, that's a loaded statement, let's backtrack a bit. I just finished livestreaming my first playthrough of FE7 and was eager to continue with the rest of the series. I was naturally planning to go with the next release Sacred Stones, but I felt drawn to play the previous game instead. For some context, Blazing Blade is a prequel to Binding Blade. It takes place in the same continent a generation earlier, but Binding Blade was never localized outside of Japan, so the connections between the two aren't as noticeable to Western fans. Of course, nowadays, fans' translation patches are more common and high quality than ever, even if these unlocalized games are still the least played in the series. Regardless of how I felt about FE7's plot, I was intrigued and slightly invested in its world, so I took the plunge, installed a translation patch, and started Fire Emblem 6. Fire Emblem the Binding Blade, or as it was known in Japan, Fuin no Tsurugi, is the 6th installment in the series and the first handheld entry, releasing for the Game Boy Advance in 2001. It is also the first Fire Emblem game made since the departure of series creator Shozo Kaga, though we'll touch on that story another day. As with the game that follows, it is set on the continent of Elip, a world which years ago was subject to a devastating war between humans and dragons dubbed the Scouring. We follow the young noble Roy, yes this time it actually is Roy of Smash Bros. Fame, as he fights to repel the military invasion of his home of Lycia, led by the Emperor Zephyr of Bern, who appears to have some connection to these aforementioned dragons in his nefarious ambitions for world domination, or something. So it's a straight jump into the standard war plot, but players of FE7 will already recognise some key characters like Roy's dad Eliwood, leader of the Lycian League Hector, who Roy initially operates under, and even the main antagonist Zephyr, who he protected from assassination as a child, ungrateful shit he turned out to be. Lyn is of course absent, given she was created for FE7, which doesn't help given that game's treatment of her, but I digress. Now about that bullshit I alluded to, let's touch on the gameplay, which, no surprises given that they're made in the same engine and style, is very similar to the game after it. It's got that solid fundamentals and counter movement tech, but with the addition of a significant jump in difficulty. I'll admit I played FE7 on normal mode, so I didn't struggle too much, and I played this game on normal as well, since hard is locked behind a first playthrough, and it has a reputation for being quite difficult, although even this game's normal mode is quite a step up from 7's in my experience. Enemies are much stronger, which isn't saying much, 7's were laughable, but these are actually tough, and in addition, your units are a lot weaker. Many of them require much more investment to get going, and the early pre-promotes actually fall off. There are still a handful of fantastic units, but they feel much more mandatory than their FE7 equivalents. The game is also less forgiving with its hit rates. This is where the bullshit or unfair sentiment comes from. You'll commonly be phasing down the barrel of 80%, 70%, even 60% hits, which adds a significant amount of variance to your strategy, and forces more defensive positioning as you must account for multiple mishaps and tomfoolery in a single turn. This does have a side effect of changing most perspectives on character and weapon balance, however. The normally frowned upon sword tends to be preferred in this game since reliable hit rates actually make a difference to compensate its lackluster damage, and classes like Swordmaster actually do benefit from their high skill stats. This difficulty is compounded by maps which are quite intense, featuring lots of gimmicks like Ballista, status saves, Fog of War, not to mention usually in combinations like Fog of War map with Ballistas and fucking Fog of War desert map with sleep staves. It's a significantly tougher game, and again this is on normal mode. And don't get me started on the fact that it contains fucking ambush spawns. Yes, this was before they decided to chill with enemy reinforcements moving on the same turn they appear, so multiple times in this game you can get fucked over by seemingly random attacks if you aren't paying attention. But the craziest part is, all this made me feel alive. Now, I don't know if this is just my fucked up brain, masochism, the fact I was streaming, or most likely some horrid combination of the three, but I look back fondly on some of the challenges I faced in this game. Others not so much. There's definitely a real thrill to being on a knife's edge and precariously securing the win. And the fact there were many times I had to just let units go to save my sanity really added to the overall meta-narrative of the run. All in all, I found the map design far more interesting and engaging than in 7. While the map gimmicks could be brutal at times, a majority of them added a healthy amount of urgency to the chapters, although some definitely encouraged more of a turtling playstyle. And in some aspects, the game's difficulty is quite fitting for its story, as Roy is thrust into leading this military rebellion despite his youth and inexperience. On a more negative note, unfortunately the support system is pretty much the same as 7's. I'm not going to go on my whole triad again, you can watch the previous review for that. Basically, my complaints still stand. Supports take far too long, so if you aren't going for the quick ones, they grind chapters to a halt. Once again, I don't have much to comment on the quality of the writing, as I barely got any. Though I will concede that the support bonuses, while just as shitty, feel a bit more worthwhile this time, since the difficulty makes them much more noticeable, especially those hit rate bonuses. As the story progresses and it becomes increasingly evident that dragons are involved with the opposition, we are encouraged to look back on the legends of old to find the weapons we need to defeat them. These weapons are the S-rank surrogates of this game, and it's a detail I'm weirdly fond of. Just about every Fire Emblem game has S-rank weapons, very strong ones that only a few units can use, but a lot of the time they're just slightly special things you get close to the end of the game, so they don't leave much of an impression. like the legendary spear Rex Hastar, which you get at the last chapter of FE7, so it doesn't really get a chance to shine. Whereas here the weapons are actually part of the game's story, and you can get one as early as chapter 8. Chapter 8 gives us the Durandal, which featured as the titular sword of the Blazing Blade, but wasn't actually usable till the last chapter, while here it's available quite early for your strongest sword user to wield. And wield it they will, since given the game's difficulty, there will be times where you feel the need to whip out their high stats and bonus stats, like Durandal's massive +5 strength to tackle a tough enemy. Furthermore, per the lore, they are effective against dragons, who appear as the game goes on, each one feeling like a mini-boss in a map, which you have to dispatch some of your strongest dragon players to fight. I've probably gone on longer about this than anyone really should, but it's a touch of gameplay story integration which I really enjoy. I also really appreciate having this powerful resource you have to manage throughout the playthrough. It again helps to accentuate the narrative importance of these items. Which leads to a common point of friction with them, and that's that, slight spoiler alert, all of them are required to unlock the game's true ending. So the weapons are obtained throughout the story, but in side chapters which are only unlocked after completing side objectives in the given maps. These usually involve keeping certain units alive or beating maps within a certain number of turns. Like to unlock Durandal's map, you must keep Lena alive through chapter 8. The key here is that it's possible to miss out on them entirely. I'll touch on the story part more, but it does feel unsettled without. Though perhaps that's the point. I'm generally all for missable content in games, but I can understand why people would see it differently. In my case, I checked a guide, but I'd been mostly spoiled on the game's story anyway. As for how the game naturally hints at these conditions, well, Again, it will be hard for me to comment on this as I knew what had to be done, so I can't gauge how to interpret the hints naturally, but I do believe a bit more emphasis and direction to the side objectives could be done intrinsically in the story, and would be greatly appreciated, especially given that some of the characters required could have died chapters ago. And I should also note that these side chapters feature the most gimmicky maps of all. Some are fine, with mild hazards, while others are a pain in the ass, like this one where most of the ground disappears, or this one here where random beams of light appear damaging your units. There are also 2 small route splits which do not change the overall story, just give you a few different maps and 1 or 2 different characters. One is based on a village you choose, which is very cryptic, and the other is based on whether a characters from a certain region are higher level than ones from another, which is, again, fine. It just doesn't really detract from the experience, but maybe a bit more diegetic info would have been nice. Though I must remind you that I did play a fan-translated patch, specifically this one from Serenus Forest, so maybe it's not an issue in the original script, though I kind of doubt it. But regardless, I'd like you to keep that in mind as we move on to the story. Binding Blade's story is ultimately quite simple, but it was enough to keep me engaged throughout the playthrough. As stated before, we follow young Lord Roy as his home region is invaded by the Empire of Bern. Roy is deployed with an army to stave off the invasion where he runs into Guinevere, the Princess of Bern and sister of the antagonist Zephyr. She disagrees with her brother's actions and hopes to meet the leader of the Lycian League, Hector, to hopefully prevent an all-out war. But by the time they reach the Marquess, he had been captured by Bern's army, and despite Roy rescuing him, Hector unfortunately dies, but not before revealing that Bern is using dragons in their conquest and assigning Roy to lead the remains of the Lycian army. So from then on, our boy Roy, at the age of like 15, needs to attempt to protect his country and figure out what the fuck's going on with Zephyr and these dragons. And before anyone gets whiny about spoilers, this all happened by chapter fucking 3. It's a lot more plot heavy than FE7's story, and since we're thrusted right into a war, quite a lot is happening. We're retaking castles, getting betrayed, getting helped by allied nations, or collecting legendary weapons to hopefully handle this whole dragon thing. It's weird, because laying it out, quite a lot happens, but I don't actually remember a lot of it, to be honest. Now, part of that is that it's been quite some time since I actually played the game, due to my avid procrastination, but I'd say it's also quite a condensed plot. The whole synopsis I laid out was, again, chapter 3, and that kind of pace follows for the rest of the story. The whole narrative stretches the world's continent, but this wide scope has made that stretch quite thin, and as such, we don't really have much time to get invested in particular story moments. As an overall plot, it's quite solid, but it's failed to hold my interest so long after playing. It doesn't help that unlike FE7, its main cast of characters isn't as rich. There are quite a lot of characters who join our campaign, but aside from moments in their joining chapters, they're pretty absent from the game's story. Now that is the case for most Fire Emblem games, but games before 7 had a much more restrained main cast. Most of the story moments are between Roy, his retainer Melinis, and Guinevere. We are later joined by some key characters for the story, but they didn't leave much of an impression on me personally. This is perhaps where the supports would have helped, but Same would go for the villains, but they do have a few standouts, in particular Narcian, who is not at all deep, but I found him very entertaining, and some of the Bern higher-ups whose moral conflict with their nation was pretty cool. It also helps that some of them deflected to become some of our strongest units, but again, like with the rest of the story, it's just lacking a bit of that extra dimension to help it stand out. I'm now going to talk about the whole true ending thing, which will contain major spoilers, so please click ahead if you have yet to play FE6. When we get to the end of the game, we realise Zephyr hates the entirety of humanity because his dad tried to kill him as a kid or something, which is why he wants to erase all of mankind and return control to the dragons by resurrecting the demon dragon of legend. He states dragons are devoid of humanity's cruel emotions and that their rule would be peaceful. This does seem to be an interesting moral dilemma. Roy stands for the goodness in humankind and the fact that people will always fight to correct wrongdoings. After all, it's what he's been doing this entire game. But the dynamic kind of falls apart. Now, if you didn't get all the legendary weapons, the game ends with you killing Zephyr and you're just left to wonder what was really going on with that demon dragon. But if you did get all the collectibles, we find out how to defeat them. Gist is, when the dragons were at war with the humans, they were severely outnumbered, so some of them decided to create a demon dragon, which could spawn mindless drone dragons to fight. The divine dragons weren't having any of that and decided to leave, but one of them, Idun, got left behind, so they turned her into the demon dragon. Now, most of the dragon enemies we dealt with in the game were the mindless drones, and by the time we actually got to meet the sentient dragon Zephyr was working with, well, we just meet one. He tells us the story of the demon dragon and the reality of the Scouring War, but aside from that, he's kind of just emotionless and fights us. Part of the issue then is that we don't actually get to explore the morality of these dragons, so the whole moral dilemma of the story is pretty much solved, especially since the dragons are painted in an incredibly bad light with their treatment of Idun. It doesn't help that the only other dragons we see in the story, the ones integrated into human society, are basically human, so this cultural difference, as you might call it, is never actually explored, and it does feel quite weird to make a stance against this emotionless worldview when it belongs to another race, but maybe I'm just reading too much into it there. But regardless, we have a bizarre disconnect here, as the dragon conflict ultimately feels like a negligible part of the game's overall plot, despite how important it is to the lore and setting, not to mention despite the prevalence of the dragons throughout the story. They for some reason left all of this world building to the very end of the game's optional epilogue. And yes, I know what I'm asking for is basically Tellius, we'll get there one day, but even then, at least a bit more would have been nice. So overall, the story didn't escape the generic allegations for me. On a more positive note, the music is of course great, just about the same as 7 I'd say, but it has some really nice tracks. So that's Fire Emblem 6, or at least what I remember of it. Perhaps I'm due to revisit the game properly, but for now it will remain a game I enjoyed but don't regard that highly. I originally intended to make some witty remark with the title of this video, like FE6 hits 70% of the time, but just like in game, those 30% you miss stick out a lot more. But now I'm not so sure. You've probably noticed quite a lot of comparison to Fire Emblem 7 here, and that's because my feelings on them are pretty similar overall. That is to say that aside from them being Fire Emblem games, I'm kind of neutral on them, so in the absence of any strong feelings, all I can really think about is comparing the two. Both of their stories don't really stand out to me. I like 7's characters more, but 6's gameplay left much more of an impression. Perhaps that's the lens to view this through. 70% of this game is just bog standard Fire Emblem, but that 30% of insanity is what gives it its character. It might be more apt to say that it's actually a 30% hit rate. While the story, plot and characters have missed my memory, the pain is what lodged itself in, though when I say it that way it sounds like I'm describing trauma. Well anyway, how do you feel about Fire Emblem The Binding Blade? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Do you think it's bullshit? Worse or better than FE7? Regardless of what this game means to you, I thank you so much for watching and hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Oh, and like and subscribe, I guess.